Hello, my name is Martha, and I'm the Heritage Collection Manager at the Evelyn Lehman Culp Heritage Collection at the Nappanee Center. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the Nappanee Canning Company and the troubles that they had, specifically about a court case that they had with the company Reed Murdoch and Company. Um, so we're just going to talk a little bit about the Canning Company itself first. So the Nappanee Canning Company was incorporated in June of 1894. The incorporators were John B. Lovett, Henry Wysong, William Miller, Jacob Hepler, Samuel Coppus, Joseph Armory, Jacob Whistler, John McTaff. Troubles that they had, specifically about a court case that they had with the company Reed Murdoch and Company. So we're just going to talk a little bit about the Canning Company itself first. So the Nappanee Canning Company was incorporated in June of 1894. The incorporators were John B. Lovett, Henry Wysong, William Miller, Jacob Hepler, Samuel Coppus, Joseph Armory, Jacob Whistler, John McTaffer, Francis Berlin, Ephraim Etmer, and Daniel Zook. According to Levi Early's diaries, the following happened. So it was solicited that you could purchase 6 shares for the new Canning Company for 2 shares for $100 each or 4 shares for $50 each. By May 16th, Levi wrote in 1894 that the Canning Company was fully organized and that they had chose a location for the Canning Company. So they selected the name of Nappanee Canning Company. They had 9 directors. It was decided that the stockholders would meet and vote on things for the company the first Tuesday in February annually, and it was decided that the board of directors needed to set the prices for the year by March 10th. So the first prices were tomatoes were $6 per ton, and corn they're paying $7 per ton. The Hartman brothers sold them property for the factory for $650. The factory, which is pictured right there, was west of the furniture factory on the corner of Madison and Randolph Streets. The Brown brothers were awarded the bid to build the factory, and it was touted by the news as the largest factory ever built in the U.S. with the latest improved machinery, and it was unsure if this was true or not. The news did state that it was the largest in its original plans, and that the others, even though they were bigger, it had than it had been because they were added onto. The goal was that in the next 5 years from when this factory was built in 1894, that it was to increase in size and exceed the industries that were larger. So the canning process, so these are some workers in the canning company. The canning process was they used the baker process. So after the tomatoes were weighed and unloaded onto the porch at the factory, they were thrown into the scalder. So it would carry the tomatoes from the hot water to the upper end where they were dropped into wooden pails. And then they were carried to the peeling tables to peel. They were handled by women and girls so then they were handed off and handled by women and girls to peel the tomatoes. So that's why you see the women in the photograph, because they were actually working and peeling the tomatoes. So the peelings and juices would pass down to the center of the tables and in a trough, and they were caught. The peels and juices were then used for making the process of making ketchup. The tomatoes would then go to the can filler, and they would be put into cans and moved down the line. The workers then would wipe the cans and put the lids on, and the cans would be placed onto a wooden tray. These trays then were passed along so that they could be received by the solder. And then each lid also had a small hole in the lid, or like a small vent hole. After the soldering was done, the tray of 12 cans would then go into what is the cooking process, and that process would take about 30 minutes. And after the cooking process was done, the cans would go through a cooling bath, then the cans would be wiped down, and they would be passed onto the table where they would be labeled. So you could see here, there are the Knapp brand tomatoes are in the pictures. You could see the boxes of 12 cans. Sometimes companies would actually send the canning company their own labels. The ketchup process, so the juices and peels would be put into a cylinder, beat to a pulp, and then they would be put into a copper kettle, and all the water would be boiled out. Then they would be placed into a maple wood tank and heated again with spices added. So then after that, it would be bottled, labeled, and ready for market. Corn, all the other items that they canned would also go through a similar process that the tomatoes went through. J.B. Levitt was the first director manager, and he had come to Nappanee in April of 1894, and he talked up the project of a cannery. So the stock company was formed with a capital of $18,000. This covered seed for the tomatoes and sweet corn being purchased, planted by interested farmers, which they had nearly 300 acres ready to harvest by the time canning season came around. Levitt left by October of 1894 and had gone to a firm in Chicago, and J.C. Mellinger took his place. The first canning happened on August 18th, 1894, and they canned 540 cans of corn. And then the first canning of tomatoes happened on September 1st, 1894, and they canned 500 cans of tomatoes. They canned 178,000 cans of tomato and 180,000 cans of corn that first year. And they also, at the end of the season, added 14,000 cans of pumpkin. In November of 1894, a grocer from Illinois inquired where he could buy more because his wholesaler was all sold out and he wanted more. In May of 1895, the Waukesha Tribune said that the Nappanee Canning Company was not a financial success. The Nappanee News made quick to mention that it hardly had any time to prove itself if it was a fail or success. In August of 1895, the factory opened to start canning corn, tomatoes, and pumpkin, and they said that they would consider to purchase first-class product from non-members of the canning company. The second year, they decided to only can tomatoes and pumpkins. To extend the canning season, then they added black and red raspberries, peas, string beans, and beans that were canned along with the tomatoes, corn, and pumpkin. The Boston baked beans, Nappanee's pride, was pork flavored and ready to eat out of the can, and that was one of their best sellers. In 1896, the manager, Mr. Loveland, was going to farmers, leaving information about planting peas and beans because they were also looking to add strawberries because in the area they had an abundance harvest and they were said to have been very big berries also. In 1896, Charles Muchler had moved to Nappanee to help his brother Albert to manage both the Nappanee Furniture Company and the Nappanee Canning Company. The brokers in Chicago wanted them to double their canning output. The canning company's goods were just not confined to Chicago, but they also went as far west as Omaha, Nebraska, and east to Buffalo, New York. At the peak of operations, 125 people were employed and would pack 22,000 cans per day. But in the beginning of 1897, the canning company's trouble started. The canning company sold what they called futures, and this is based upon past sales and yields of crop. The company could hold futures if the market price was more than what I should say, the company could withhold futures if the market price was more than what was originally sold for. So it seemed that buyers were purchasing cases from the Canning Company without without the knowledge of the company's debts and insolvency. And here's some more. Here's another picture of inside of the factory. You can see the little kids that were probably helping to peel, along with the workers there. So the lawsuits. There are quite a few lawsuits here. So we have Norton Brothers of Chicago. In February of 1897, the Nappanee Canning Company, through their attorney Perry Early, filed a suit against the Norton Brothers of Chicago. The Canning Company had been buying all of their cans from the Chicago firm, and during the season of 1896, the cans proved to be unsatisfactory. The Canning Company was suing for the amount of $120. The Chicago firm failed to reimburse the Canning Company for the loss sustained by a failure of the cans coming up to warranty. But then the Canning Company had then purchased another carload from Norton's, and they had to pay $600 before they would hand over that carload of cans. And they hadn't been credited by the Norton Brothers hadn't credited the Canning Company or reimbursed them. And this is really unknown if there was a judgment in this case. But really, where the Canning Company's troubles started and everything started to come to light about how much trouble the Canning Company was in was with the case of Reed, Murdoch and Company. The museum was actually able to obtain these court documents thanks to the Elkhart County Historical Museum and the Elkhart County Genealogical Society, since the Genealogical Society is the owner of the crimp records, so the criminal records, and they've all been put onto microfiche. So a big hearty thank you for allowing us to take a look at those documents and to obtain copies for ourselves. So in October of 1897, Reed, Murdoch and Company of Chicago filed a suit on contract against the Canning Company. The trustee and directors, and the preferred creditors. They wanted a judgment of $1,500 for breach of contract. On April 7th, 1897, the complaint alleged that the defendant sold the plaintiffs 2,000 cases of tomatoes to be delivered in Chicago. So the first 1,000 cases were to be delivered no later than September 15th, and the other 1,000 cases no later than October 1st. The plaintiff demanded delivery prior to filing suit, and the company trustee of Samuel Mosselman, so the Canning Company and their trustee, Samuel Mosselman, wholly failed and refused to deliver the tomatoes. The Nappanee Canning Company was and had been for at least 6 months prior to the 5th day of October wholly insolvent, a fact well known to the directors of the Canning Company. The Canning Company was in a debt amounting to the sum of $19,000 past due and unpaid, which the company was unable to pay. The assets of the corporation only amounted to, at the time, of $9,000. The directors at the time were Francis Berlin, Barney Uline, Frank Coppist, Tobias Hartman, Henry Wysong, Jacob Whistler, Joseph Armory, John Albiam, and Ephraim Emmert. Francis Berlin was the president. Barney Uline was the secretary, treasurer, and general manager. On October 15th, on October 5th, 1897, the Nappanee Canning Company executed a note that the Nappanee Canning Company bargains and sells and conveys to Samuel Mosselman all of its property, real, personal, and mixed. So Samuel's job as trustee was to collect all the debts owing to the Canning Company, and that he shall sell at private or public sale to the best advantage that he can for cash or upon credit the Canning Company. So the factory, everything in it. And they had 60 days to sell the Canning Company. So the proceeds from that sale would pay the trustee would receive a reasonable compensation for his services. All debts owed to persons who bought tomatoes during the 1897 season would be paid. So Reed, Murdoch, and Company would receive their money back. It was also to pay the Farmers and Traders Bank 3 notes executed by the directors. So they had taken out a note of $500 on June 30th of 1897, $661.91 on August 9th, 1897, $3,550.19 on August 11th, 1897. They needed to pay an account owing by the grantor to Kappas Brothers and Zook, and then they needed to pay on notes of $1,100 from George Barber, $500 from M.H. Middlehall, $500 to I. Bloomberg, $600 to George Searer, $200 to Joseph Armory, another $1,000 to Joseph Armory, and $3,000, which $800 had already been paid to the City National Bank of Goshen. After all of that was paid back, then they would need to pay the laborers and the superintendent. And the trustee was supposed to continue business until he could sell the company. So we have some players here in the game. So the Farmers and Traders Bank was mentioned. So we have Samuel and Harvey Kappas. Kappas Brothers and Zook was also mentioned, and that is Frank Kappas, John Kappas, and Daniel Zook. So the Kappas brothers were stockholders in the company. So not the men individually, but the company was a stockholder. So just keep that in mind, that some of these companies were stockholders and not the individuals themselves. So the Canning Company continued to do business 2 weeks after October 5th, 1897. None of the beneficiaries in the trusted deed, other than the directors, Kappas Brothers and Zook, and Farmers and Traders Bank, knew of the execution of said trustee deed. The financial condition of the Canning Company was better on October 5th, 1897 than it was on April 7th, 1897, when the sale of 2,000 cases were sold to Reed Murdoch. Samuel Mosselman paid nothing of the value for the property, so he didn't pay a dime. They just gave it to him. And so because of this, the Kappas Brothers and Zook were of great interest of the attorneys because they owned $600 in stock in the company. They had also given the Canning Company $1,500, and Mr. Zook wanted that money back from the Canning Company. One, it was said because the company of Kappas wanted to protect themselves, and they asked for a settlement. So, and then also the Harmon Brothers General Store owned $600 in stock. In Levi Early's diary, he talks about going and collecting on notes in March of 1897 on behalf of the Canning Company. So it's almost like they were going and collecting their dues from stockholders and things like that of this promised money. Um, the Canning Company was making contracts on good faith. So in 1897, they had orders for 5,000 cases of canned goods. Mosman knew nothing about the business, and he answered correspondence, although he did delegate a lot of it to Mr. Uline. Mosman held no stock in the company, and he said in his deposition that Frank and Harvey Coppice came to his house and told him that they needed a trustee. Mr. Mosman was just a guy who owned a hardware store in Nappanee. Reed Murdoch had a few people interviewed from Chicago. So Henry Frisk was a canned goods broker. He testified that the market prices in September and October of 1897 was 85 cents a case for 1,000 cases. N.A. Coble, a broker and commission merchant in canned goods, dried fruits, and edible goods, also was interviewed, and his company was the agent for selling the Canning Company's good in Chicago, and they had been for all 3 years of the existence of the factory. They said that the contract was signed on April 7th, 1897 by one of their salesmen to sell 2,000 cases to Reed Murdoch. So that contract was contracting the Nappanee Canning Company to do so. The Nappanee Canning Company was sent a duplicate of the contract, and they acknowledged this contract, saying that they would deliver those 2,000 cases. Mr. Coble knew that the contract had been carried out, but he wasn't told by Mr. Uline that it had, or he how should I put this? Mr. Coble knew that the contract had not been carried out, but he didn't know that it wasn't carried out until November or December of 1897. So after all of this happened, Mr. Coble didn't know that this was happening until Mr. Uline had a conversation with Mr. Coble in his office. Mr. Uline told Mr. Coble that the company had gone into the hands of a trustee and that they would not be fulfilling any of their orders sold by Mr. Coble's company. W.E. Stearns, who is a buyer for Reed Murdoch and Company, also was interviewed, and he made the contract with N.A. Coble and Company and their salesman to purchase the tomatoes from the Nappanee Canning Company. After Reed Murdoch failed to receive an answer from the Canning Company, they sent a letter asking where their product was and that they were waiting to receive it. They received no reply, and they had sent a gentleman to Nappanee to talk to the Canning Company. I couldn't find what happened when the gentleman from Reed Murdoch came to Nappanee to see why they hadn't received it, so I didn't find anything about that. But the damages against the Canning Company was awarded in lower court and later appealed. So Reed Murdoch initially won the case. The judgment was appealed, and it stood pending for 3 years. It had originally been appealed to the Supreme Court of Indiana, but a new law had been put into place, so it had to go to the appellate court. The appellate court upheld the verdict in favor of the Chicago firm. But it was eventually appealed to the Indiana Supreme Court, and they appealed the case and basically stated that the stockholders tried to be the owners and the creditors at the same time. And so they could not give themselves or someone who represents them a mortgage on its property. So it also cuts off the rights to other creditors when the corporation becomes insolvent. So because Samuel Coppice of Farmers and Traders Bank had stock, because Coppice Brothers and Zook had stock, because Hartman Brothers had stock, they were able to basically get themselves out of this case because they became their own creditors. So they couldn't give themselves a mortgage on his property. So it's all rather interesting, and it's really interesting that this court went from um, 1897, 1898, and it wasn't until like 1902 before the Indiana Supreme Court gave their decision. Um, so here are some of the court documents um, that this is basically the defendant's answer to the complaint, and they deny each and every allegation. Here's actually the invoice from Mr. Coble, Mr. Coble's company, stating that they were selling 2,000 cases to Reed Murdoch and Company. And then this is a letter from N.A. Coble to the Nappanee Canning Company, telling them, thanking them for their acknowledgement, and that all the changes were made to the contract. Here is another one from the Canning Company that they had accepted the contract. So another court case that came about was Reed, Walsh, and Lang. So this was a new suit that was filed by this company in 1898 against the Canning Company for $4,000 in damages. The complaint recited the defendant was contracted on May 8th, 1897 to sell the plaintiffs 2,000 cases of tomatoes, so 2 dozen 3-can cases to the case at 65 cents per dozen. And on September 17th, another similar order, all for future delivery. So this company also sent 2,000 labels to be placed on the cans. The plaintiffs claimed that they were obligated to purchase 2,000 cases at the advance of $1,000, and that they also paid $2,000 in advance. The company wanted a judgment of $4,000 in damages, the cancellation of the deed of trust, a restraining order to prevent the defendants from selling or disposing of the assets of the company, and the complainant alleged that the Canning Company was insolvent and had been since the contract had been made, and that they owed $20,000 on all past due and unpaid. The complaint also had charges that their transfer was made to Samuel Mosselman to hinder and defraud creditors. This case was eventually ordered off of the docket in smaller courts. I really didn't find why it was ordered off the docket, but this one went well into the early 1900s as well. So the sale of the Canning Company. In January of 1898, a committee was formed to help get the papers and to make arrangements to sell the Canning Company. In the newspaper, the sale of the Canning Company appeared in the January 12th issue, and the sale was said to take place on February 15th at the corner hardware store. They said that the factory could produce 12,000 cans of tomatoes per day, and it was reported in the February 16th issue that the Canning Company was not sold and that there were no bids. They had a few interested parties from Chicago, but not much was talked about after that. But in March of 1898, a new company was formed. You could question if they did not give a deed of sale because they couldn't be stockholders and creditors at the same time, or if nobody just wanted to take on the Canning Company's debts. So the Nappanee Canning Company, became the Union Canning Company in March of 1898. The stockholders had dissolved the Canning Company and formed a new organization, naming it the Union Canning Company. They kept all the same stockholders and officers that had formed the Nappanee Canning Company. According to the Marshall County Independent, the Canning Company canned over 500,000 cans of tomatoes in 1898, and that farmers received $225 for a single acre of crop. Tomatoes became a staple at 400,000 cases a year, with upwards of 200 barrels of ketchup. Their employment reached 167. By 1903, tomatoes became unprofitable, so they focused on pumpkins, pickles, and sauerkraut. November 1st, 1904, the company was purchased by the Lachlan brothers, and when the building was sold to Lauder Shaw in 1913, that factory became the hemp factory. A new cement block sauerkraut factory went up on the B&O Railroad at Onionville, a mile east of town. In 1917, the factory was purchased by Libby's and became Libby McNeil Libby Sauerkraut Factory, and it closed in the 1960s. So that concludes the case of the Nappanee Canning Company. I hope you learned as much as I did in researching this, and this has really always been on my mind, but I never could find much information on it until I received the help from the Elkhart County Historical Society. The resources used in this program were the Nappanee Advanced News that's available on Hoosier State Chronicles through the Indiana State Library, and also the crimp records from the Elkhart County Genealogical Society. Thank you very much, and have a great day.